August 6, 1945, a single bomb wiped out an entire city. Within mere seconds, over 70,000 people were incinerated by the atomic blast over Hiroshima. By the end of the year, that death toll would rise to over 140,000 due to radiation, burns, and injuries. Imagine an entire city, its homes, schools, and hospitals obliterated in a flash of searing heat. The bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, marked a pivotal and tragic moment in human history. It was the first time a nuclear weapon was used in warfare, forever changing the course of World War II and shaping global politics for decades to come. Dropped by the US B-29 bomber Enola Gay, the bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was a weapon of unimaginable destruction. With this single event, Japan was pushed toward surrender, effectively bringing an end to the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. But the impact of Hiroshima wasn't confined to military strategy. The city was left in ruins, and thousands of civilians perished instantly or suffered from the aftereffects of radiation. The horrifying consequences served as a grim reminder of the power humanity had unleashed, sparking debates on the ethics of nuclear warfare and a nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War. While the atomic bombing of Hiroshima achieved its immediate objective, forcing Japan's surrender, it sparked an ethical debate that continues to this day. At the time, U.S. leaders, including President Harry S. Truman, were faced with an agonizing dilemma. The war had dragged on for years, with Japan showing no signs of surrender. A planned invasion of Japan was predicted to result in massive casualties on both sides, potentially over 1 million. In this context, the atomic bomb was seen by many as a necessary evil, a way to end the war swiftly and save countless lives. But the moral cost was staggering. Hiroshima wasn't just a military target. It was a thriving city, home to over 300,000 people, many of them civilians. The bomb's detonation not only obliterated the city but also exposed survivors to lethal radiation, causing suffering that would last for generations. Leaders like Truman had to grapple with whether such an extreme measure was justified in the context of war. On one hand, proponents argued that the bomb shortened the war, preventing further bloodshed. On the other hand, critics argued that the use of a weapon of mass destruction against civilian populations was not only unethical but set a dangerous precedent for the future. Moreover, the decision wasn't just about ending World War II. It was also about positioning the United States as a global superpower at the dawn of the Cold War. By demonstrating the bomb's devastating power, the U.S. sent a clear message to the Soviet Union, signaling the beginning of a nuclear arms race that would define international relations for decades. Ultimately, the ethical question remains: could the end of World War II have been achieved by other means, without unleashing the horrors of nuclear warfare? And at what point does the cost of victory become too high to bear? The path to Hiroshima's devastation began long before August 6, 1945. By mid-1945, World War II had already dragged on for 6 years. Germany had surrendered in May, but the Pacific War against Japan raged on. Japan's military had proven resilient and unwilling to give up, even in the face of relentless bombings that had already devastated cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Behind closed doors, U.S. political and military leaders wrestled with how to end the war swiftly. One option was a full-scale invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. However, the costs were predicted to be astronomical, both in terms of military and civilian casualties. U.S. military strategists estimated that an invasion could result in over 500,000 American casualties, with millions more on the Japanese side. In this context, the newly developed atomic bomb was seen as a potential solution to avoid such a costly invasion. The Manhattan Project, which had been in development since 1942, was nearing completion. The project represented years of secretive, high-stakes work by some of the world's top scientists, including figures like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb, nicknamed Trinity, was conducted in the New Mexico desert. Its unprecedented power confirmed to U.S. leaders that they now had a weapon capable of ending the war with a single strike. With the bomb ready, President Harry S. Truman and his advisors convened to discuss its use. The decision was far from unanimous. Some military officials, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, expressed doubts about the necessity of using the bomb, believing that Japan was already on the brink of collapse. However, Truman and his inner circle ultimately decided that the bomb was the quickest and most effective means to force Japan's surrender. Hiroshima was chosen as the first target for several reasons. It was an important military hub with supply depots, factories, and troop concentrations. Crucially, Hiroshima had been largely spared from earlier firebombing raids, making it a pristine target where the full impact of the atomic bomb could be demonstrated. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, took off from Tinian Island carrying a 10,000-pound bomb named Little Boy. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped from 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, it exploded 1,900 feet above the city with a blinding flash of light, releasing the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, the city below was engulfed in a fireball, followed by a shockwave that flattened buildings within a 2-mile radius. For those living in Hiroshima, that day began like any other. Many were on their way to work or school when the bomb exploded. Survivors described the intense heat likened to the surface of the sun, as everything around them caught fire. Thousands of people were instantly vaporized. Those farther from the epicenter suffered horrific burns and radiation sickness. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods were erased from existence. One survivor, Shigeko Sasamori, who was only 13 years old at the time, later recalled, "There was a blinding flash of light, and then the whole city seemed to be swallowed by fire. I was thrown to the ground. When I got up, my skin was hanging off my arms like rags." Another survivor, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, described treating the wounded at a hospital amidst the chaos, where patients' burns were so severe that their flesh peeled off at the touch. The aftermath of the bombing was no less horrifying. Fires raged through the city for days, and those who survived the initial blast faced a slow, agonizing death from radiation poisoning. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and the city was in complete disarray. In the days following the bombing, black rain, a radioactive downpour, fell over Hiroshima, further contaminating the area and sickening anyone exposed to it. The immediate death toll was catastrophic, but the suffering didn't end there. In the weeks and months following the bombing, tens of thousands more died from injuries, burns, and radiation sickness. By the end of 1945, the death toll had reached an estimated 140,000. The bomb's impact would be felt for generations, as survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered from long-term health effects, including cancer and genetic mutations passed down to their children. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, an ordinary morning in Hiroshima turned into a living nightmare. Without warning, a brilliant flash of light lit up the sky as the atomic bomb Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city. In that instant, everything changed. The explosion unleashed an unimaginable force equal to 15,000 tons of TNT, and the heart of Hiroshima was engulfed in a searing fireball. Temperatures at ground zero soared to over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel and vaporize human bodies. Those closest to the blast were instantly incinerated, leaving nothing but faint shadows burned into the ground, a haunting reminder of the lives that were snuffed out in a heartbeat. Buildings within a 2-mile radius of the explosion were flattened by the shockwave, and the mushroom cloud of debris, fire, and smoke rose more than 10,000 feet into the sky, casting a dark shadow over the city. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Survivors describe a deafening silence following the explosion, as if the world had gone still. Then came the sounds of people screaming for help, and the sight of those who had managed to escape the epicenter, horribly burned, clothes tattered, and skin hanging from their bodies. A teacher who survived the blast later recalled, "I saw students running and falling to the ground, their bodies scorched black, their eyes were popping out of their skulls." Hiroshima had become an apocalyptic wasteland. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out in seconds. Fires ignited everywhere, spreading rapidly, consuming the few buildings that remained standing. In the streets, people staggered through the rubble, their faces blank with shock, searching for loved ones amidst the devastation. One survivor, Akiko Takakura, recalled the moment she realized the scale of the destruction. Everything had disappeared. The buildings, the people, nothing was left. I could see bodies everywhere, some missing limbs, others burned beyond recognition. Takakura, like many others, was only a teenager when the bomb fell. She would spend hours wandering through the wreckage, looking for her family. The survivors who didn't perish in the initial blast faced a new horror: radiation sickness. They called it the invisible killer. Those exposed to the radiation began to suffer from nausea, vomiting, bleeding, and hair loss within days of the explosion. Hospitals and clinics already overwhelmed with the injured were unable to cope with the influx of patients suffering from this mysterious illness. Dr. Shuntaro Hida, a physician who treated many of the bombing victims, described the horrific conditions. People were covered in burns from head to toe, their skin peeled off in sheets. There was nothing we could do. The wounds wouldn't heal, and many of them died in agony. The survivors' bodies were now poisoned by the very air they breathed, the water they drank, and the land they stood on. For those at a greater distance from the explosion, the sight of the mushroom cloud signaled a terror they couldn't yet comprehend. One witness, miles away from the city, described watching the cloud rise into the sky. It was as if the sky itself had opened up and hell was pouring out. The emotional and psychological toll on the survivors was incalculable. People who had lost everything, family, friends, homes, were left to grapple with the nightmare they had just witnessed. In the span of minutes, Hiroshima had gone from a bustling city to a smoldering ruin, with over 70,000 lives lost in the blink of an eye. Thousands more would die in the days and months to come, their bodies ravaged by burns and radiation. The moment of the bombing is etched into history as one of humanity's darkest hours, a key moment that revealed both the devastating potential of science and the terrifying fragility of life. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima left scars that would never fully heal. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to over 140,000 as radiation sickness, burns, and injuries claimed thousands more lives. In the years that followed, survivors, known as hibakusha, faced long-term health effects, including cancer and genetic damage, while the city itself was left to rebuild from the ashes. The bombing also had global consequences, ushering in the nuclear age. It demonstrated the terrifying destructive power of nuclear weapons, sparking an arms race that would define much of the Cold War. Nations around the world now had to confront the grim reality of total annihilation, something that still haunts global politics today. Yet amidst the horror, Hiroshima's story serves as a powerful reminder of both the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. Today, the city stands as a symbol of peace, advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons so that no city, no people ever have to experience such devastation again. The legacy of Hiroshima still shapes our world today, and we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments about the impact of this event. And if you're interested in learning more, check out our next video on the history of nuclear weapons. Don't forget to like and subscribe.